Hi, hello, and welcome everyone to today's kind of impromptu webinar on COVID-19. Before I hand it off to Mike Riley, I just wanted to mention a few things about logistics. We are encouraging you all to use the hand raise feature today for the actual Q&A at the end of the session. So if you raise your hand, then I'll just go and unmute you manually, and then you'll be able to ask your question directly over the audio line. However, if you prefer not to speak or don't have a functional mic or whatever, then you can always just type your questions in like normal in the questions / chat tab, and we'll address those as we are able to. Feel free to type your questions at any time. And this webinar is also being recorded, so you can reference it afterwards if you need to, and the handout is available in the handout section here, so you can download that at any time as well. So without further ado, I want to hand it off to Mike Riley.
Thanks, Mike. Good afternoon, everybody. And for some of you, it's still morning on the West Coast. First and foremost, with the last name Riley, I have to say happy St. Patrick's Day to everybody. If you were in my house, you could smell the corned beef and cabbage in the slow cooker. So that's my hope for the future this afternoon. I want to thank you for joining us. We shifted to this topic fairly quickly because, as you can imagine, it's consuming all of us in higher ed and certainly everybody in the country and globally as well. So we wanted to talk a little bit about some of the implications that this may have, in particular for your planning for your meetings and conferences, which you have in the future. What we'll cover here today is some guidance that the CDC has put out on event planning, which I think could be very helpful. We have some guidance from the American Society of Association Executives, who have also been navigating the question of impacts to meetings and their guidance, particularly around some of the legal ramifications concerning meetings. We'll have some discussion of the considerations as you plan for your conferences, raise some questions to consider. And then we really want to spend a lot of time having a chance for you to share kind of your insights, thoughts, questions, kind of where you are in your planning. Some of you, as we've looked ahead to the schedule for state and regional conferences, we saw I think there are 3 coming up between now and June 1st. Obviously, those 3 have some different considerations than perhaps others, but I think I saw 5 meetings scheduled for June, a few throughout the summer, and then many in the fall, which may have a different dynamic. So with this rapidly changing landscape, we want to try to give you some tools to be able to plan both near term and then considerations for further down the line. So before we get started, I do want to give Jack Miner, our president-elect, just the opportunity to say a few words. Jack?
Thanks, Mike. Again, I want to really thank everybody. One of the things that we all acknowledge is that this is a really busy time for everybody in their regular roles, as well as your home life. And we really appreciate everybody taking the time out to specifically concentrate on what you're doing for your state and regional organization. Again, what we really want to try to provide today is a little bit of background, but again, as Mike said, most of what we'll try to do today is give you a little bit of opportunity to hear what your peers and colleagues are thinking. So it gives you a little bit of insight of what some of the other states are struggling with, some of the other states and regionals are trying to solve. So you can start to think about with your own board, what are the things you need to prioritize both in the short term and in the long term. And then the other piece was really just to make the commitment that the ACRAO is really here to help you as you go through this and to help think about opportunities for us to be able to provide information and support as we go forward. So with that, I'll hand it back to Mike.
Thanks, Jack. So Mike, if you can go to the next slide. So we adapted this a little bit from some advice that came out from the Center for Disease Control and Prevention around meetings and events. And as obviously that has been a key component of the guidance that's been coming out. As you see, the size of the permissible event has shrunk. We saw, the District of Columbia say 1,000-person event, CDC moved to 250, and just yesterday, President Trump suggested 10 or fewer members for a meeting. So this is just rapidly evolving. But so some of the things to consider here, obviously, as you're moving forward, are the overall number of attendees. Larger gatherings obviously raise more concerns. And the other factor is certainly thinking about the people who will be attending your meeting. The guidance that has come from the government and the CDC has certainly noted that, for example, people over 60 are more at risk than those who are younger. And from the understanding of the demographics that we're aware of for ACRAO members, about 20% of our members are over 60. So that's certainly something to consider as you're moving forward with your event. Next slide, Mike. So again, the density of attendees within a confined area, kind of think about those as you're making some decisions about canceling. You know, obviously things happening in the next 4 to 8 weeks, some of those decisions have already sort of been made for us because there's limitations. But, you know, as we move out further in this crisis, these are some of the things to think about. You know, the potential economic impact to participants, attendees. I know a lot of people that we have seen on our listservs where ACRAO is a member of the Council for Higher Education Management Associations, which are a group of associations similar to ACRAO, other higher ed, usually student personnel, student service administrators, are all thinking about this impact. And part of their decision to move forward or not with their meetings is based on, well, this meeting is what generates a lot of our revenue for the organization. So if we don't proceed, that has impact. So that certainly complicates your decisions. Certainly you need to look and see if your community has more levels of the virus than others, and you know, start thinking about ways to significantly reduce the number of attendees at your meeting. Next slide, Mike. Again, I'm going to move through these fairly quickly because this will be available to you to look at later. Really start to think about your emergency operations plan. You know, we don't, if you think back to the successful meetings we've had over the years, that's probably was not a big part of our planning, but it needs to now be a significant part of planning for all of our meetings, having a very defined emergency operations plan. So meeting with your planning team, with the hotel, with anybody that's security that's working at it, anybody who you're contracting with to come in and do sound or other things, you know, really starting to think through a very robust emergency operations plan. Next slide, Mike. This is another suggestion that I really agree with, is really start establishing relationships with the key community partners or other stakeholders. So again, where you may not have had a robust communication plan with all of your vendors or contracted personnel or speakers or entertainment or those sorts of things, transportation, etc. You know, from now into the future, I think we're really going to have those sort of partnerships well established as we prepare for our meetings, so that there's very robust communication, and this, of course, also participating in community-wide emergency preparedness, because my guess moving forward, you know, unfortunately, we will be more prepared for these in the future because of this happening to us. But those sorts of dynamics will now be part of our meetings moving forward. Next slide, Mike. And of course, this is just, you know, the reminder that we are seeing everywhere, the kind of daily practices that everybody needs to do. You know, as we were preparing for our meeting in New Orleans, we were, you know, lining up hand sanitizer and thinking through things like no longer having our buffet meals, because you can't imagine anymore having, you know, hundreds of people handle the same serving utensil, for example. You know, but these kinds of things are now going to be a big part of our planning, just these constant reminders about sanitation and healthy practices. Next slide, Mike. You know, another thing, just again, just making sure that in the future we have supplies and all these sorts of materials now as part of the ongoing process. And of course, you know, hadn't thought about this before, but you know, sanitizing microphones and meeting surfaces, computer screens, all those kinds of things, I think will now be part of our normal routine functions. So one of the other things that we see them suggesting is really, even if we do proceed, things lessen, we'll still have staff that may be concerned about participating. So, you know, building flexible staff attendance plans and sick leave policies, those kinds of things. in case some staff may not be comfortable. You may have some people that are later in their career and consider themselves at risk. So, you can still find ways for them to engage and participate, but they may need to do it remotely. They may be the person you get assigned to kind of a remote management of some activities. Also, the suggestion about identifying a space that can be used to isolate staff or participants who become ill at an event will also be part of our activities in the future. Again, limiting in-person contact for staff. That's obviously something that you're all doing right now as part of this social distancing. The second bullet, certainly starting to think about flexible refund policies for participants. Most of us have generally stuck to our planned refund policies, but obviously in these sort of tumultuous situations, we need to be more flexible. We've certainly had to navigate that ourselves. And also kind of identifying actions to take if you need to postpone or cancel your event. So again, if you've made the decision to proceed with an event that's further out on the calendar, have things in place so that you can very efficiently and quickly cancel and move to your emergency plan should you need to do so. Next slide, please. This is again updating and timely and accurate information. One thing we've seen over the past couple of weeks is the importance of trusted, informed communication. And unfortunately, sometimes we've seen that a little bit of what not to do. But this is something we need to all focus on, is make sure that we're very straightforward in our communications with our members and our participants, give them good information, update it regularly, over communicate rather than under communicate, and certainly not cause panic, but be as authentic and accurate and honest as you can in your communications. Next slide, please. So, one of the things we know is going to happen is this is going to end, and we're going to move to a period where the coronavirus impacts are lessened and we can begin to return back to normal. That's something to very closely monitor with public officials is, when can we begin kind of ratcheting down some of the security steps that we've put in place. I think a lot of these sort of basic sanitation and safety things are going to be now a part of our meetings from here into the future. But some of the activities that we need to do may be lessened as time goes by. So that's something that you want to make sure that you work with emergency professionals to be able to kind of ratchet down some of the activities that you need to do. Next slide, please. And of course, I think, moving forward, you will now have a much more expanded team for your meeting planning. You want to keep that process in place so that you're regularly communicating, so that everybody is on board and they're gleaning new insights from their partnerships and yours as well. And you want to participate in community-wide emergency activities. Okay, I want to shift here to some things about legal perspective, and this comes from the ASAE. This question about what do you do when an emergency happens and it impacts your meeting, your conference, or your event. Some people talking about whether they should proceed even if no one will show up. If you're worried about losing your contract or losing money and you need to proceed with the hotel, this is a big dilemma about whether or not to proceed and whether or not people will come. But you should know that these kinds of things have been dealt with for a long time. While this is certainly the largest event any of us have ever seen, these kinds of things do happen. So wanted to look a little bit on two key areas. That's meeting contracts and insurance. Next slide, please. So a lot of new terms coming up for us. I bet you probably never used the term social distancing before, and you probably hadn't paid much attention to the term force majeure, but in many cases it's in your contracts with your hotels or other folks who you've contracted with, and it basically means overpowering or irresistible force. An act that's outside of the control of the parties to the contract. One odd thing about it is, these are generally available in contracts, but they're probably the least negotiated. And unfortunately, in a situation like this, they may become the most important. And in many cases, the force majeure clauses are only in place if the entire event is canceled. It's not a partial situation. So that's another thing that you know, in some cases, unless the meeting is forced to be canceled, not just a reduction in attendance, the force majeure may not go into place. Next slide, please. You know, this is just something to keep in mind for future contracts that you may negotiate. This is some sort of a model force majeure contract provision that gets at some of the more advanced concepts around force majeure. So keep this for the future. Next slide. You know, one of the some terms that you may see here is the impossibility versus impracticability versus frustration of purpose. And so, you know, hotels and convention centers basically favor language that that you only terminate without penalty if it's impossible to host the event. So it's kind of an all or nothing thing. So one of the things that people are suggesting is that event planners try to include some verbiage that references what they call commercial impracticability, which means, you know, unforeseen events that took place after you sign the contract that make it difficult for you to fulfill the obligations of that. And the last concept is frustration of purpose, which, you know, means that an unforeseen event has undermined the principal purpose of your entering into this contract. If your purpose is to provide professional development and you're unable to do the event, you have this frustration of purpose. So in doing your next contract, really take into account some of these force majeure clauses. You know, one thing that people are raising as a possibility is to, you know, in your contract say if our attendance was reduced by 25%, for example, that could be covered in that reduction in revenue. It may not hit the entire event, but it's reduced the revenue that we're going to get so that there's some coverage here. Next slide, please. You know, again, ideally, this commercial impracticability is in there. And in these agreements, you really want to state the purpose of your meeting so that were it to be undermined and you can no longer achieve that purpose, you can try to use this frustration of purpose argument. Next slide. Okay, for many of you, of course, your contracts are already signed. Your meetings are in the near future. What do? Well, make sure you read your agreement's force majeure provision carefully and see if it has any qualifying statements like requires a CDC emergency or a WHO declaration. We saw with our colleagues in a lot of the other associations that those kinds of qualifying statements were in their force majeure clause. In ACRAO's particular policy, it was not, because the way it was constructed by our insurance that covered communicable disease, those references were removed. They do suggest that as you're leading up to a meeting and something happens, you want to poll your registrants to get a sense of whether or not they may cancel your registration so that you have that information to be able to suggest, even if there's no reference in your policy. These are kind of a common law practice to be able to say, hey, this is what's happening. We've polled our members. They're frightened. They're not going to come. We'd like you to consider this. You want to be sure to talk with your attorneys in hotels and convention centers. And the obvious reminder that contingency planning does not begin once there is a potential risk. It begins when you start selecting a destination, vendors, etc. Okay, so we've gotten through those kind of advice from the CDC and from ASAE. Now I want to just move and kind of prepare us for some discussion for the remainder of the webinar, where we kind of hear where you are, what your thoughts are, you know, questions you might have, if you've gleaned any insights that might be helpful to share with our colleagues. But, you know, so some of these considerations here, obviously you may be considering, should we cancel our conference? Should we postpone our conference? Should we consider moving to a virtual conference? So I can tell you, as you can well imagine, ACRAO agonized over this decision about whether to cancel or continue with our conference. Obviously, a week to 10 days later now, those decisions are sort of made for us. Nobody in the near term is proceeding with a meeting of any size, but certainly when we were making that decision, we were thinking about our insurance, thinking about our hotel contracts, thinking about the importance of these meetings to our membership, certainly be honest, thinking about the financial impacts as well. You know, postponing the conference for us, really not a possibility just because of the scale of our meeting where we're working with convention centers and we're booked so many years out. We've seen some discussion from other colleagues about thinking about pushing their meeting out a few months, for example. One group that was thinking about that has now abandoned that idea, just again, because, you know, you just heard the president say this may be going on till into the fall. So that's a consideration. The virtual conference, that's obviously going to be a big trend for lots of organizations. We're certainly in those discussions. We'll be having a board call tomorrow and talking about some of our ideas for moving forward with a virtual conference. At this point, we're thinking of, you know, some of the sessions that were filed for the meeting, arranging those thematically and doing those as a series of webinars, you know, probably starting in April, late April and into May as a means of sharing content. One thing, just anticipating questions about this, you know, there are some good resources out there for doing virtual conferencing. One suggestion that we would have, that we certainly take advantage of as a 501c3 is we are signed up for a group called TechSoup. That's TECH soup.org, and we'll share this reference later. That allows us to get significantly discounted software, and one of the things we get access is to Zoom discounts. So you might want to consider looking at that resource and consider going to a Zoom Pro or a Zoom business account to be able to have some of your sessions recorded and then delivered in a virtual format. Would also note that Google Hangouts, if you're not talking about a lot of people, Google Hangouts is a process that's there. So those are certainly available as a tool to be able to do some virtual content. This question about how our finances will be impacted from the decision to proceed or cancel, I'm sure that's, you know, front of mind for a lot of you. Another question to think about is, if you don't hold your conference, what activities do need to be conducted in some fashion? You know, for us, we require a business meeting. We need to have our budget approved. We do transfer of officers and those sorts of things. So you might want to think about, if you don't have your meeting, what is absolutely essential for you to move forward and perhaps schedule a webinar to be able to conduct those activities. And then I raised the question about, you know, how will COVID-19 outbreak influence how we plan for future conferences? It's obviously probably going to change the way we do business from here forward. But again, when you now start planning, do you always have a virtual backup as an option? Do you always have an alternative date as an option? Maybe you negotiate a date in your meetings normally in the spring. You might also have one in mind for late fall. You know, do you have these kinds of discussions? So these are all some considerations that I think, you know, we're certainly having as the National Association, but certainly all these things are probably front of mind for you. So if we go to the next slide here, we really wanted to take, you know, just kind of that short setup period and ask if any of you are willing to share through using the raised hand function, or you could put a question into the question box. But how are you preparing for impacts to your conference? Share your thoughts, ideas, or questions. Is there anybody that's wants to go first here at this point of the webinar?
So Mike, I do see, I'm having a little hard time getting, I do see that there is a question. There are a couple of questions. Sorry, I'm having a little trouble navigating the question box because it's really small.
It's no problem.
Yeah.
If you
Can you
press
see it, Mike?
Yep, if you press that little box with an arrow pointing out, it'll pop out the entire questions tab so you can resize it. Ed Trombley did have his raised hand, so I was going to unmute him really quick.
Okay, so go ahead and do that while I get the rest of the questions out.
All right, Ed, you're good to speak.
Hey, everybody. This is Ed Trombley. I'm the ACRAO president in Florida, and I was going to say this one we were looking at as well because our conference is scheduled for the third week of June. Right now, we've sent out a notice to our membership telling them that at this point, we're still planning to hold it. We posted it on the front page of our website. But quite frankly, the news recently that it might stretch out throughout the summer and into the fall is sort of giving us the impending sense of doom. I'm not sure that we're going to be able to do this in June. So I just wanted to share the technique that we're going to use, or the plan we're going to follow, is to reach out and work with our hotel. I imagine most state and regional organizations have probably booked at least a year in advance. We are already contracted for 2021 in another hotel in Orlando, but I'm going to work with our hotel to see if we might be able to keep the conference with them in 2022. That way we don't need to find another place. We've actually done a lot of the legwork to prep already for it. They won't lose the booking and we won't lose the site. I intend to be able to offer them, the opportunity to hang on to the contract, to hang on to the deposits that we have, and see if we might just be able to transfer the date should we have to cancel. I'm hoping that that will be incentive enough for them to not penalize us, although we do have a force majeure contract in our clause in our contract. I'm not sure in the end by June whether it will be our call if we're simply not getting people who are able to register or feel free to register at that point, or whether it's something that is dictated by the county or the state. But if it looks like we're not going to be able to hold a successful conference, we want to try to get a lead on it and see if we might be able to negotiate in this way. So just as an option.
And that's really helpful. It just reminds me that we had some very good news today that the New Orleans Hilton, which was our conference hotel, where we had both activities and a significant room block, they canceled our contract in exchange for us rescheduling for New Orleans in 2026. So for us, unfortunately, that's that far out, but you can see that they're willing to do those kinds of things. And to the association, that was probably $800,000 to $900,000 obligation that wasn't covered in our insurance because our room block is a separate situation. So yeah, I think that's really good advice. And from what we've heard from colleagues, hotels and convention centers are really flexible right now because they're worried moving forward about their business. So thanks for sharing that.
This is Jack. One of the other things that I'll share that I know that some of the folks have started to look at in some of the states is start reviewing your contracts with the hotels and with the other folks affiliated with your conference, because a lot of times they'll have either a 90, 120, 160, or 180 day cancellation option. So there may be scenarios where you're able to start having those conversations now to think about contingencies just in case that even go further out than May or June.
This is Melanie. I also
please
go ahead. I also just wanted to share that a number of our colleague associations from the higher ed community are reporting really positive feedback from the hotels that they are willing to be very flexible. So I think if you're very proactive about it, you're going to find that they're going to be very willing to rebook because they want to have a successful event as well. Would you like me to read another question, or did someone else have another comment?
No one else has their hand raised right now. So you can read away.
All right. So a couple of things that I see someone is talking about. Jonica Dreyer is discussing that she may propose to cancel the in-person option and utilize some of the tech options shared to host a few sessions virtually. I attended an ACPA webinar just an hour prior to this session, and I think hosting an enrollment-based conversation with our peers to share how we are addressing COVID from our various lenses. For CAP ACRAO, I proposed 4 options to my board, 2 in-person and 2 online virtual options. Before proceeding, my president and I wanted to attend this session to learn how to operate within ACRAO guidelines as the nature of this situation changes. We always utilize the college campuses, which brings its own set of issues. Our meetings are scheduled for early June. So that's just some feedback. Some additional questions. We're asking for what resources are available to regions or states to facilitate a virtual conference. And I might ask that to all of the folks in the audience what are you using if you are thinking about using a virtual platform?
So while that's queuing up, for ACRAO, we obviously have this webinar platform that we're using right now that will be a major part of our process moving forward. It's obviously GoToMeeting, but we're also, and Mike Sisson can chime in here since he's more familiar with this, going to be using our open water platform, which is our abstract manager, to be able to do some session capture, and then creating some webinars. We don't envision having like a one-day long planning meeting or a virtual meeting, but for somebody that does wants to have more of a conference feel, you probably could construct it that way. But tools like Zoom and I suppose even Skype could be used for some people. The Google Hangouts function, those are, Google Hangouts is a free service that's there. So as we continue to move forward, we'll share, more suggestions for this, but I do suggest that you do look at the TechSoup and see if you can upgrade, in particular, your Zoom account, because that certainly works well. Anybody else have any ideas?
This is Melanie. I have one other thought on that, and that is that a number of the vendors who are in our space have been exceedingly generous in trying to support their higher education colleagues. And so at the association level, if you have a vendor who might have a platform that you would have access to, you might actually see if they might want to move the sponsorship to a sponsorship of your virtual meeting. That might be a possibility if someone wanted to sponsor the actual virtual portion if you don't have access to a tool, or if you are on a higher ed campus and having your meeting there, you might be able to negotiate use of one of the platforms at the institution. And so that might be some creative ways to get something inexpensively and quickly.
Mike, this is Michelle Kelly from Wisconsin ACRAO. Hi. I think one of the attendees was asking about ACRAO guidelines for creating a virtual conference, and you gave multiple good ideas, but I just want to be clear, are there such guidelines that exist or not? And if not, that's fine. Just just giving out ideas for people to look at different options. But I know that a lot of times we are wanting to work within guidelines, and if there aren't any guidelines, that's good to know too.
Yeah, I would say at this point we don't have guidelines for conducting virtual meetings. ACRAO has not done any, and ironically, one of the shortcomings of our plan, we were going to do a virtual track through the Tech and Transfer Conference, and we still hope to do that, but that would entail having a room that's set up as your virtual room and just running the sessions through there and recording them. Obviously, you can't do that if you're not physically holding the meeting. So this is kind of a new space for us that we've not navigated, but we'll, in addition to some of these guidelines, we're going to learn a whole lot, because as part of the CHIMA listserv, this has been a very big discussion, and they're all in the same space that we are. I mean, only a few organizations, I think EDUCAUSE has done some in this space, but we're all going to learn a lot. So we hope to develop some guidance, but right now we're just kind of seeing what good ideas seem to be floated.
Great, thank you.
I noticed Jonathan also asked a question about who disinfects these items when I talked about the suggestion to clean things up through the conference. We had reached out to our audiovisual provider for that, and as the meeting canceled, we hadn't finalized the plan for that. We have heard several of the associations said they had identified volunteers who would be wearing either gloves or masks to kind of go through rooms to do this. But that's another thing we'll glean from our colleagues and see if we can get some good best practices suggestions for how you do that. I mean, certainly some things like we were prepared to move. We were not going to have buffets. You've all been to our exhibit halls and receptions there where they're all buffet lines. I cannot imagine buffets being part of the future at meetings. So we were talking about whether or not we had to hire servers to be able to serve the meals, or behind the spray skirts, or I guess this what you call those, but definitely those kinds of things need to be considered, or whether your future meals are just ones that are grab boxed things, boxed lunches, etc. I mean, that's another dimension that we have to navigate in future meetings. Anybody else want to share where you are in your thinking for your meeting? Again, we've got a few folks that are meetings are coming up very soon. Those decisions are probably being made, but as Ed pointed out, for FACRO in the middle of June, that's now starting to be in this window of concern. What are other people thinking?
While we're waiting for people to, oh, go ahead. Did someone share?
Well,
No,
I can share.
Please.
This is Michelle Kelly. Our conference isn't until November, so we haven't really had any discussions about the conference itself, but we have an in-person planning session that we have every year in March to get the ball rolling, to get sessions created and the like, and that was supposed to happen tomorrow, I think. And that was canceled, and we've needed to come up with a plan to have the president of WACRO work with the chairs of the committees, and then the chairs of the committees to schedule calls or video conferences with their individual committees to get the ball rolling with the creation of sessions. So that whole process is starting in a virtual manner. And we also have a veterans conference in the summer that I really had not thought of until we were just getting on this call about needing to get rolling with that, because I'm not sure what we're going to do. That's at an institution as opposed to a hotel, so I don't know how that'll impact it, but just sharing, that's where we are at this point.
Okay.
This is Melanie. I'm happy to share a little bit about how ACRAO, just to get things going, is looking at converting our meeting online. It's very preliminary at this point, but we'll be reaching out to all of the presenters who were selected for annual meeting, and we will plan, we'll be reaching out and having them let us know whether they can participate in a webinar, or whether they can, or whether they would like to do a Connect article on their sessions. And then we'll plan a track over the between, I think Mike said, indicated earlier, it would be late April or early May. So that process, we're just re-engaging with the folks who were already selected and seeing who can participate and moving in that direction. We're hopeful that that will go well.
So I see we had a question about, how do we access GoToMeeting through the national office? Is there a participant cap for GoToMeeting? GoToMeeting is a pretty more sophisticated webinar platform. I don't know that it's necessarily what you need to do. Again, I think Zoom can work for you and is more cost effective. We do have a cap on the number that we can have in a particular webinar. That's why we record all of our webinars and allow them to be available later. So it's not an inexpensive solution. I don't know that it's a necessary solution for everybody. But again, we'll gather some resources about using things like Zoom and Google Hangouts and other things. And again, for many of these, you'll record them. They won't necessarily be live webinars, which is one of the advantages of GoToMeeting. But if that's not necessary as part of your process, or even if you do want to do things live, you can certainly do that through Zoom and other tools as well.
Melanie mentioned the idea of partnering with some of our vendors. But remember, the other thing is that a number of our institutions have either already made a significant investment or are in the process of making significant investments in technology as well. So there might very likely be opportunities where the state and regional organization can partner with institutions to be able to leverage that. So even if you think about it, many of us are probably looking to do some recovery around what our conferences and information would be in hopefully summer, late summer. That's probably going to be a time that a lot of our institutions are not using those tools in the same way as they're using them now. So again, we maybe have an opportunity that we wouldn't normally have there.
And Mike Burkas has a hand raised, so you are now unmuted. Mike, you can speak.
Hello, everybody, and thanks for hosting this. It's really helpful to hear all the suggestions, and I feel for for ACRAO and for the regionals and states that are having their meetings sooner rather than later. We're in November, so I just wanted to say and answer your question, what are others thinking about it, that honestly, we hadn't given it a lot of thought, and this gives us a framework to start thinking about it. I did have one specific question, though. I suspect the answer is the same as with your vendors, but what about your speakers? Did you have any issues with canceling the speakers, and did you have the force majeure type of riders in the contracts with them?
Yeah, we do have the force majeure in our contracts. We've just started some of the discussions. Our first ask to them was, can we roll your talk forward? For example, Ibram Kendi, we certainly would love to have him in Washington, D.C. as well, and we think it'll still be a good topic. So we're trying not to use force majeure in those cases to cancel the contract, but first start by saying, would you be willing to move forward? Now, having said that, Mike, one of the suggestions that we're going to approach, and it could be Ibram Kendi, is whether or not he would be willing to do a virtual session as part of this virtual conference that we do. So that's some negotiation we still have ahead of us.
Got it. Thank you.
This is Melanie. I see a question here from Edward Tremblay. It says the FACRO conference is the same week as ACRAO's Hill Day and the Leadership Conference. Just to follow on your thoughts regarding timing, when will ACRAO make the call on if those will move forward? Do you have a general suggestion on the correct lead time to make a decision to cancel? Or would you suggest we just base it on our contracts?
So that particular topic of the leadership meeting is on the agenda for our board call tomorrow. Does either Louisa or Jack want to comment on that right now? I mean, it's certainly front of our minds, because again, that's right on the window of concern.
Yes, this is Luisa Havens Gerardo, and it is in our agenda tomorrow to actually talk about the leadership meeting. A big point of contention is the contractual dates that we have as well, in terms of being able to make other arrangements or think of alternative ways of handling the meeting. Definitely the course of the CDC guidelines and where the peak of this situation seems to be right now also is another thing that we're going to have to consider tomorrow. And so it is front of mind, and I would say that we will have a definite course of action by the end of the meeting tomorrow. And as always, our team in Washington in headquarters will communicate to the leadership as to what that decision is. I don't know if Jack wants to add anything else.
The only thing I'll add is actually a little bit more about what I feel like kind of watching from the sidelines were from the context of the ACRAO annual meeting. Is it was a little bit of making the right decision, but there was also a little bit of timing to when we made that decision too. As Mike made reference, we made that decision because we felt like we really needed to for the safety of our members, and because we were seeing so many of our member schools do travel bans, and we just realized that economically it didn't make sense to do the conference. But had we fast forwarded a few weeks, we would have realistically been in a case where, again, that decision was made for us. And I think as you think about some of these guidelines that are being put out right now, and especially state by state, some of you may very well be in a situation where guidance or decisions that are being made on your state level may actually force your hand a little bit on making the decision to cancel or reschedule the conference. And it actually, the other benefit of that is it may also put you in a little bit better situation from a force majeure, because you may end up being in a case where you would have been in a situation to argue that a little bit more and been a little bit more on the defensive, and now it's a little bit more routine. I think that's why we heard a really good response from Hilton today, was because, again, they were in the same situation where as things progressed, it was a little bit less about us making a decision and more about the decision being made for us.
Other thoughts or people willing to share where they are, particularly, those of you, again, some of you who are in between now and June, that Jack just said that decision's probably been made for you, but I know the real agonizing ones are, what do you do for those that are June or July? Ed certainly shared his thoughts because they're right in that window, but anybody else had any conversations with your colleagues and want to share any insights or have questions?
Well, this is Michelle again. It's a question that I hadn't thought of until just now, but I wonder if we were to have a virtual conference instead of an in-person one, if there would be a reduced registration fee for people, so then there could be some revenue still coming into your association, and the people who would be attending them would be getting, those benefits, so it would be worth it for them. It hadn't occurred to me about how you would work the fee structure of a virtual conference. If anybody has any thoughts on that.
Well, I agree with you that you could do it with a reduced registration fee. We should say, for what we're planning to do following up the annual meeting, we weren't thinking of charging at this point because that's a canceled event that we're going to try and share some of the content that would have been made available. But as you asked that, there are certainly some opportunities for some revenue, because you don't have as many expenses, obviously, associated with hotels and facilities, et cetera. But you could provide some good content for a reduced rate, give your members some professional development, but also generate a little bit of revenue for the membership, particularly for the association, particularly if you did it, say, as a slightly extended virtual meeting where you took an afternoon or part of a day to do it rather than separate webinars. So I think there could be some positive dimensions of a virtual meeting for your membership. Anybody else have any thoughts on that question? Okay.
This is Melanie. I just have one more comment to tie onto that, and that is that after this experience, we will all be much, much better prepared to deliver virtual content. And I think that our ability to successfully deliver virtual content will probably have an impact on how we plan meetings in the future and how we deliver content in the future. I think we will learn a lot from the experience. We'll know better about what works and what doesn't work. And I can't imagine that this isn't going to have an impact long-term on how we think about delivering content of value to our members. And I would think that for all of you, that will be the same.
And I can certainly envision ACRAO building a little bit of a library of content through our resources that could then be used to augment what you deliver locally. That's something we'll certainly think about, plugging in, you know, a Leroy Rooker presentation, which is always of interest to the membership, to be able to kind of have up-to-date things from him to be able to insert into a virtual conference that you put together. So I'll give one last, we've got about 10 minutes left, but if people need to get back to their day, I'll give one last opportunity for folks to share. Anybody have any last thoughts or insights or questions? Okay, if not, Mike, can we just move to the last slide? We've put together a couple of resource suggestions here. If you've not seen, ACRAO will have a COVID-19 resource page, and that's a good one to consult. It's not just around meetings, but we're trying to glean as many insights as we can. Some of the guidance from the Department of Ed. We just saw the department give some FERPA guidance around COVID-19 releases. You know, we'll try to have as many resources as we can. So if you want a page to go to that is sort of organized around items of interest for higher ed, we'll have that. Certainly the state and regional organization page, if we start to develop some tools or guidance to help you with those, we'll post them there. And one other thing, just this reminder of the regional listserv. Now, I can't say enough about how beneficial it has been for ACRAO to be part of this CHIMA listserv. And as we've all navigated this period over the last 3 to 4 weeks where we're all thinking about our meetings, that's been a really good sharing tool. So certainly using the state and regional listserv to share insights if you've got some, you know, idea that came up that would be helpful. If you have questions, we have some information there. If you're not using it, you can subscribe there, and some other useful listservs. So Jack, any closing comments from you as we prepare to sign off?
Wash your hands.
Wash your hands. All right, everybody. Thank you so much for attending, and we certainly appreciate the challenges that both on your campuses that you're navigating and in your role as your association leaders. And you know, again, this is a kind of particular burden on you, because as we've seen over the last few weeks, strong leadership and strong communication matters as we move forward. So we're definitely assured, because of the strong leadership that we know that is out there in our ACRAO state and regional organization. So thanks very much, everybody, and do take care.